Welcome to the Balancing Act, How to Have It All, where you'll hear experts share exactly what you need to achieve optimal health and well-being while still achieving your professional goals. Hi, I'm your host, Susan Holzapfel, and today I'm really excited to have Dr. Thomas Lewis here with us. He holds a PhD in chemistry from MIT and certification from the Harvard School of Public Health. He's an entrepreneur and healthcare professional with expertise in toxic substances, drug development, biotechnology, health technology, and medical protocol development. For the past 12 years, he's worked closely with senior researchers and clinicians at Harvard Medical School, and he's developed a program for chronic root cause prevention, screening, diagnosis, and treatment. Alzheimer's disease and the most serious eye diseases, macular degeneration and glaucoma, have been a particular focus. So thank you, Dr. Lewis, for being here. I'm really thrilled you're with us.
Susan, really great to talk to you and get our message out, because I think it's a sort of a quiet message that a lot of people don't know about.
Yes, I agree. And a lot of people need to know about.
Right.
So maybe let's start out with you giving us a little bit of history about yourself, your colleague at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Clement Premp.
That's correct, yep.
Yes, and your overall experience and understanding of Alzheimer's disease.
Right. No, I appreciate that opportunity. So you gave a little bio on me. I'm a scientist, and I really have morphed myself into what I call a medical scientist, and I've always been interested in Alzheimer's, and 13 years ago my dad passed from the disease. 12 years ago, I found this remarkable clinician, Dr. Clement Premp, at Harvard, and he showed me some data on what he does with patients that just blew my mind. I mean, he's basically been reversing Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases for a long time, extending back into the 80s, and doing it very quietly. But he's an ophthalmologist, and what's unique about him working at Harvard is he worked side by side with internal medicine doctors, and he began to see the connection between eye diseases and whole body diseases and brain diseases like Alzheimer's. And with these internists, he developed protocols to really early diagnose and then treat these diseases. And what he found is these are not brain-only diseases. They are systemic whole body diseases. And if we hang on to the paradigm that like Alzheimer's is a disease of the brain only, which neurologists do, we'll never make any headway. You have to move it into a more functional, integrative approach. Right. And so Dr. Premp is really an amazing clinician in that respect. And I also work with Dr. Kilman McCulley, who is the founder of the homocysteine theory of cardiovascular disease and a pathologist at Harvard for umpteen years. So those are my two main mentors.
Well, within the last month, 60 Minutes aired a special on Alzheimer's, and a neurologist on that show made the statement, "It's a shame there's no way to detect Alzheimer's disease early before a person has symptoms." So what do you have to say about that statement?
Yes, that's an interesting statement, but there's so many things to be said about that makes that statement completely incorrect. So I'll work back from Harvard Medical School, not my team, but at Mass General Hospital. When they do MRIs on people with mild cognitive impairment, which is before true Alzheimer's can be diagnosed, these people already have as much as 15%, 20% brain atrophy. So clearly seeing the disease is progressing in the brain, and at some point when you get enough atrophy, it kicks over in terms of being clinically relevant, but we're seeing it. Now, it would be totally impractical to be screening the world's population with MRI to see the earliest changes in the size of the brain. But we're seeing it in the eye, and it's been well published by Harvard and by folks in Australia and now around the country that you can start seeing changes in the eye that reflect what's going on in the brain. And actually the brain is an outcropping, the eye is an outcropping of the brain. Dr. Dowling at Harvard has this book called The Retina, the Approachable Part of the Brain. So we see neurodegeneration in the back of the eye, and the eye is transparent. You don't have to poke any holes or drill any holes in the brain or open up someone's chest to look at their heart, we can see the nervous tissue in the back of the brain, and we can see the vascular tissue and the blood vessels in, did I say back of the brain, in back of the eye. So because it was interchangeably. So that's, now we have the MRI, now we have the techniques we use to evaluate the eye, and they're so simple and inexpensive. But then to back it up even sooner, and when I say sooner, we can probably see Alzheimer's in the eye 10 years before someone has symptoms. But we also do blood tests. And there are many folks, a group out of Texas, have developed a Alzheimer's detection and measurement algorithm based on blood. We do the same thing. When I say the same, we measure blood. And we're seeing markers of Alzheimer's 20 years before someone has symptoms, and it's a very clear trajectory. But if you work from the philosophy that Alzheimer's is a brain-only disease, then the peripheral blood is taken out of the equation. But since we realize it's not a brain-only disease, we're able to see physiological changes like elevated homocysteine, even elevated white blood cell counts, and C-reactive protein, inflammatory markers.
Yes.
That portend this disease. So we can risk stratify people and tell them, hey, you may not get Alzheimer's, but compared to someone else with cleaner blood labs, you're at a much higher risk. How about we work with you to lower those blood labs that make you at risk?
Wow, that's interesting. And like you said, it's systemic, so somebody may be seeing their physician about something completely different. But when some of these blood markers come back in the blood work they're taking, physicians should start be able to recognize some of those and start talking to their patients about risk for Alzheimer's, I would guess.
Right, and some famous people have spoken to this subject. David Perlmutter, who's one of the top neurologists in the world and one of the few that recognizes the brain systemic connection, wrote the book Grain Brain and Brain Maker. And what his thesis is when you start seeing insulin resistance, pre-diabetes or diabetes, this affects the brain, and it affects the brain function, including memory, and can actually maybe be a precursor to Alzheimer's. And this makes total sense. What people don't realize is our brains, the neurons in our brains, the cells in our brains, use 10 times more energy than, say, muscle. So when you have something like diabetes, you're not efficient at converting energy to fuel. And if the brain is using a lot more energy or fuel, then you have a crisis when you start having insulin resistance. So diabetics, if they live long enough, and that's not a threat, but it's sort of statistically true, are more likely to get Alzheimer's in the future because their brain is being impacted daily, and it's a slow, insidious process.
That's really interesting, and that's yet another reason to really work on your lifestyle and your diet if you're becoming pre-diabetic or you're seeing insulin resistance is getting started. Interesting.
No, exactly.
Like you said, it's not even just that, but that is one area where people seem to be more likely to have Alzheimer's, so it's certainly an area you would want to spend more effort in trying to prevent.
We tend to look at disease in silos, and now I have a question on my whiteboard that I walk by every day, and it says, where did you learn that? Okay, where did you learn that? So we've learned through media, through the pharma companies, that diseases are all separate. Alzheimer's is separate from cardiovascular disease, is separate from fibromyalgia, that's separate from heart disease, separate from diabetes. But when you go even something as simple as WebMD or Mayo Clinic and look at risk factors for any one of these diseases, the risk factors are all the same.
Right.
So are the diseases really different? So if you're preventing one disease, if you have good behavior, then you're preventing a myriad of diseases. So how Dr. Tremp even got into the Alzheimer's space is by treating eye diseases, not as an eye in isolation, but treating the eye disease like glaucoma and macular disease and cataract as what it is, a systemic inflammatory, whole body systemic inflammatory disease. And patients would come back. Now, this is not a quick fix. It's something you do over time to start correcting someone's physiological problems. Patients or patients' loved ones would come back to his office and say, Dr. Tremp, my husband or my wife, whoever the case may be, their memory has improved. Their short-term memory, their forgetfulness has improved as well. And that caught him actually by surprise. He didn't get into Alzheimer's as like, I'm now going to solve the Alzheimer's conundrum. It happened the way Dr. Alzheimer's, who the disease is named after from 100 years ago, said medicine should be. Medicine should, good medicine starts with observations in the clinic, not in a test tube. And we have it kind of backwards today. Just a point for your listeners, it's like the busy professional woman, trying to balance it all, and they're worried about their husband, they're worried about their parents, their in-laws, and the idea is not to wait for something to happen and then react to it, which is what we do. When you understand what Alzheimer's really is, then you can take on lifestyle behaviors and characteristics and to prevent the disease. And we've Dr. Tremp and myself have written a book, The End of Alzheimer's. It's available on Amazon. It's available on my website. And for full disclosure, it's written at a fairly sophisticated level, but if you went to, say, my chapter on prevention, chapter 10, there are some very simple things you can do to reduce your risk of ever getting Alzheimer's. And obviously we talked about perlmutter, we talked about diabetes. It's reduce your sugar intake, things you know.
Right. Increase
the amount of healthy fats. Your brain is highly lipid in nature. It's highly fat. It needs to be fed with fat. Neurons, that where all the electrical transmission occurs, happens on the cell membranes of neurons. And those cell membranes, to function properly, must have a fairly high amount of omega-3 fatty acids in their composition. So take your fish oil. If you're a vegan, take your fish oil. Increase your vitamin D, magnesium intake. Increase your micronutrient intake by consuming sea salt. Increase your vitamin K2 intake to remove calcium from your vessels and keep your vessels healthy. These, exercise a little bit. These are some of the basic things that the woman on the go or the professional on the go or the busy parent can do. And it starts with the children and before. So what is good for the goose is good for the gander and is good for the gosling and is good for the entire family.
Oh, that's really interesting, and that's something that, like you said, a lot of busy women these are things that they can easily fit into their routines and actually prevent Alzheimer's to begin with. For
Absolutely.
Themselves and their family members.
Right. No question.
Now, you mentioned, again, we were talking again about this being more of a systemic issue, being a disease of a sick brain and a sick body. So can you provide some insight into your understanding of the root causes of Alzheimer's?
Very simply stated, it really is an issue of immune dysfunction. So all these risks that we talked about, all these preventative measures that we just spoke to, are all things that boost your immunity. So what we're finding in Alzheimer's, and it's true if you read my book, it's true in cardiovascular disease and diabetes too, it's you make yourself vulnerable by taking in too much sugar, by not exercising enough, by not digesting your food well because you're taking proton pump inhibitors. And for example, I have a blog on that. I'll get to that if we remember. But so you're not absorbing food well. We have GMO food. We have food that is grown so that it can grow well in magnesium-deficient soil because it's less expensive to use a GMO seed than it is to fertilize a field with magnesium. So the plant's magnesium deficient. Guess what? We eat the plant, we're magnesium deficient. But it's worse than that because the plants synthesize vitamins from those minerals that are essential. In other words, we don't produce them in our own bodies. We must get them from food. So we're eating empty, low micronutrient density foods. So that's why we're seeing, so the foods, the proton pump inhibitors, the lack of exercise, the fact that we don't eat a wide variety of foods anymore, the toxic exposures that we have, the lead paints, the mercury amalgams, all these things, no one thing makes us vulnerable. But like the straw that breaks the camel's back, all these little things contribute to us being weak. And we don't know we're weak. It's not like our muscles weak, but our body, our immune system is weak. And in that state, we are much more susceptible to, and this is chapter 9 in my book, intracellular infection. And so let me give you an example. I'll name one organism, Chlamydia pneumoniae. Half the world has been exposed to it, but not that many people have symptoms of it because they have healthy immune systems. Well, our immune systems are getting weaker and weaker. More of us are experiencing symptoms from it, and like Lyme disease, some of these things, sometimes these symptoms can be very hard to detect, but these organisms can get into our brain and create neuroinflammation, which is the first stage of creating hypoxia, which is a lack of oxygen, which then starts killing cells. And in the brain, killing neurons leads to cognitive impairment, dementia, and Alzheimer's. So what we're finding then, just to recap, is behaviors, lifestyle that create some level of your immune system being compromised can manifest in an infection that can get in the brain and really wreak havoc. And I think it's very important to point out that these are not genetic disorders. There's very little genetic connection to Alzheimer's, despite what the folks who have an axe to grind in this space say.
Right.
Most of it, and I'm saying 98% of it, is in an individual's hands to prevent. Then if they have a disease, what happens is you can no longer do simple things like take your vitamin D or your cod liver oil and reverse it. You probably have something that is going to require more aggressive treatment, but we'll never know until we diagnose it properly. And Alzheimer's disease is not a proper diagnosis. It's a cop-out. All it is a constellation of memory dysfunctions that a neurologist then assesses, but it gives you no idea of what the underlying cause is. We do tests in our clinics, by the way, that really get into the root of the underlying mechanisms of this neuronal dysfunction or death process. And we've been very good at and effective at diagnosing and treating people with this condition, even fairly late stage. And I have that fairly well documented on our website with testimonial videos and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot of hope for people out here. Wow.
Well, it's really sad that 60 Minutes just came on, and there's still, you see, there's such a push by the associations to bring more research dollars into Alzheimer's. If you read the preface of my book, what I'm saying is there's so much information out there that has not been translated from the research community into the clinic that we actually don't need more research. We need doctors who are willing to step outside the box, take the information that's already known, and apply it to their patients. But in our society, with the FDA, the insurance companies regulating what the doctor can do, and standard of care is not a standard of making people well. It's a standard of not getting sued by people because you're following the the old-fashioned methodologies that everybody else is doing, so you're protected. And we have a system that does not encourage best-of-breed clinical practices. You know, our clinics are private pay, unfortunately, because the standard of care doesn't work, and the standard of care is what pays doctors within that insurance payer system. So if you want to get well, you have to find clinicians that understand what disease is, number one, and a lot of them do, but number two, are willing to work for you outside of the system and take risks and, you know, do the right thing.
Right. That's very hard to find, like you said.
It is a challenge.
Hopefully things will be changing in that arena as we become smarter about healthcare.
Right, and it's only through education. So I laud you for a program like this and having me on. You know, there's a lot of good docs that get it, and they're not getting the credit. As a matter of fact, you know, Dr. Tremp was constantly rated at the low end, and that's, you know, the rating system's crazy. It's like, are you given the drugs that are standard for eye conditions that every other doctor is giving? And in the meantime, the National Eye Institute said there's no cure for glaucoma. While Dr. Tremp is reversing glaucoma all the time, you'd think he'd be rated best.
Yeah.
He's not, because he's not given those drugs or following those procedures that are standard that every other ophthalmologist is doing that is not working.
And speaking of Dr. Tremp, you know, you told me that he's constantly saying that you start preventing Alzheimer's with the unborn child. So what does that mean? Can you explain that? Yes,
it's a simple and complicated issue at the same time. A lot of folks say, "Oh, well, that's a hereditary issue." No, your brain. You know, we find that a lot of disease and a lot of preconditions are passed down from the mom to the child. So like type 1 diabetes, for example, very clearly in a lot of cases it's a passed down disease. So that's one issue, is passing down disease. Number two, so much immunity and brain development happens pre-birth and then during those first 3 years of life. So one of the things that people talk about in terms of Alzheimer's is cognitive reserve. Well, you start building great brains very early in life, and you start building all the immune structures and the adaptive immunity and all that stems from the first 3 years of life. So like Dr. Axe just recently wrote, he's a chiropractor who's very well, he sends out a fantastic message. He just wrote a book called Eat Dirt. And, you know, you look at how we build gut immunity, which is so critical to our overall health. Well, you know, kids pick up things, and we don't want them to choke, but kids are supposed to be picking up things outside, and this is a natural, God-given activity of children to build their immunity. They put things in their mouths. They get a little bacteria. They develop the proper gut flora. One of my blogs is how an article just came across my desk today about the gut Parkinson connection. I wrote an article based on research that shows things like Prilosec, Nexium, all these proton pump inhibitors lead to more dementia. So, you know, so we need to start developing our robustness, our resistivity to disease at the earliest stages of our genesis, of our life. So there's at no point can you not consider the future. You know, we think we're immortal when we're 20 years old. You can still be working on your health at that point. And then what I tell seniors when I talk to people that are 80 years old is, consider this: your brain, if I see you in 6 months, every cell in your brain will be different than when I saw you today. Right. And that is true of your grandchild, your children, and yourself. So there's no time on your life spectrum when you should stop comporting yourself in the best possible way for your brain health, and the best way to do that is to comport yourself in the best way for your overall health.
Right.
So it's a complete what we call a spectrum disorder in that regard. It's like there's no spectrum of your life that should be ignored, which makes it all the more challenging for the hustle and bustle society we live in. The fast food, all those processed oils and the inflammatory components that are in there all contribute to the epidemic of the chronic inflammatory diseases, of which Alzheimer's is one today.
A little while ago, you mentioned, some of the treatments that you're doing at your clinic, or that you're doing some treatments that a lot of other doctors aren't doing right now. So how do you treat Alzheimer's, and how successful have you been?
Well, I would encourage anybody, if I'm allowed to give my website, to go to Real Health Clinics, and that's with an S, realhealthclinics.com. And on our main menu bar under patients, we show in sort of stick figure, very simple schematic diagram what our protocol is, and it's very simple. We do a record review. We do blood tests to look for inflammatory markers and other markers of the disease. We do the eye test to see if what the eye test does is we can actually see if tissue is changing. If tissue is changing, you do have disease. If blood's changing, your body may correct the situation and you don't get a disease. But when you start to see tissue changing, you have disease, and that's the power of the eye in diagnostics. And then we generally will go, it's not one blood test, it's a series of blood tests, and it's the way we interpret the blood tests. So we're going to run 2 different programs with individuals. The first is going to be a pure coaching to health program. It's, these behaviors and these foods and these lifestyle factors are creating risk, and let's just ameliorate these first, whether you have the disease or you're just worried about the disease, because we're much better at treating someone whose body is well prepared for treatment than treating someone who's in a compromised state.
Sure.
So that's phase 1, and then phase 2 is based on what we call a differential diagnosis, which is really looking broad and deep. What are we finding based on our understanding of the mechanism of this disease that we can modulate? And those are the things that we're going to treat. So if it's an infection, we can go herbal, natural, all kinds of different ways. Dr. King at our clinic in Lake Mary, Florida, if she finds infection, we'll be using UV blood irradiation, for example. There are folks around the country that do hyperbaric oxygen. Dr. Tremp, being more of a classic allopathic doctor, uses a cocktail of anti-inflammatory antibiotics for those things. But, not everybody has this component, but when you do, like Lyme disease, if you don't treat it aggressively, then it's very difficult. I mean, they have to be treated aggressively.
Again, you talked about Alzheimer's being multifactorial and sharing the same risk factors with other diseases. So can you explain that concept and what your team is doing in chronic disease in general?
Right. So the issue becomes, how do we overcome a reactive medical system? That is, we treat cardiovascular disease after you have the event. We treat Alzheimer's after you have dementia. We treat diabetes after your blood sugar is through the roof. So we're writing and we're about to publish a new book on this. And what we've developed a very simple scale for people to understand their risk, because there's a lot of people walking around that we call apparently well, which means they're not really well, but they feel okay today. And that's a large population that needs to be addressed. So in my new book, which is titled Quarterback Your Own Health, How to Take and Lower Your Chronic Disease Temperature, I highlight 3 individuals, Tim Russert, David Goldberg, and Jimmy Lee, all very prominent people who in the primes of their lives died suddenly, and medicine really has nothing to offer in terms of why. And, when I lecture on this, I say, okay, Tim Russert, meet the press.
Right.
The day before he had his heart attack, was he perfectly healthy? And most people say no. And then the week before the month before, the year before, how about the decade before? So we've developed a series of tests that help us determine where you are on a continuum of health. So, for example, if I measure, are you smoking, are you eating a lot of sugar, those are all risks, okay? So people can be stratified by risk. And some people with risk never have a health problem. So we do two things. We stratify people by risk, and we have coaches that are heavily involved in that process. What are the lifestyle behaviors and things that you can modulate? But then we stratify people by health. What is your physiology telling us about how your risk factors may be actually impacting your health? And we marry these two together to really create a profile on an individual's health. So we call it the chronic disease temperature. We take many biomarkers. We measure the biomarkers on you individually, and we put this into our algorithm that our MIT and Harvard scientists have developed, and it spits out a physiological health score. So it's based on 98.6. Anything above 98.6 is inferring a health risk. It doesn't mean you're going to die tomorrow. The higher that number is means just the more likely you are to have an adverse health event, usually chronic, vascular, neurological, metabolic, sometime in the future. And the higher that number, the more likely it is to occur, the more severe it's likely to be, and the sooner it's likely to occur. But the beautiful thing about these biomarkers is that we understand what factors in your physiology lead to these biomarkers being elevated, and so we can develop a treatment plan for you. And sometimes it's a pharmaceutical intervention. A lot of times it can be going back to those risk factors, not your health factors, but the risk factors of your lifestyle and behavior, that if we can modulate those, then we're likely to downregulate your health factor, your chronic disease temperature. So think about this, you increase your vitamin D, you increase your fish oil. Is it working? Well, we can measure you physiologically to see if it's actually having an impact on your health in real time in your body. And so that's the kind of feedback that we really need. So we're no longer guessing, take this and I think it'll work. No, we'll prove to you it's going to work, and we'll prove to you that it is working. And so, Susan, you asked about Alzheimer's. All I can say is that we've treated people in their 80s who basically didn't know where they were, and have made substantial improvement on these individuals. And I invite folks to go to my website and look under our video testimonial section to see the kinds of endpoints that are achievable.
Right.
No promises, because it all boils down to the diagnosis. I mean, if we, when we diagnose, can thoroughly characterize and understand that individual and understand those risks and understand the actual causing factors and identify things that we can treat, now we have a pretty good handle that we can probably make someone better.
That is just wonderful. Like I said, that gives people a lot of hope, because so many people assume that as soon as you hear the word Alzheimer's, you have no more hope. So, well,
I would suggest they behave just the opposite. When they find out that they have risk or they're having some memory issues, the sooner they act, the more likely that clinicians that understand this disease well will be able to help them.
Right.
So,
right.
and time's not on your side, so people, you can't take the ostrich attitude and bury your head in the sand. It's really, you have to be proactive. That's why we've written this book, Quarterback Your Own Health. You don't rely on your clinicians, your standing clinicians, because they're just going to say, well, we'll just measure you and we'll measure your decline and prove to you you're really declining.
Right.
That's not acceptable. So this book hopefully empowers people to take on the kind of tests and measures that are meaningful about their health and can tell them where they are in this health disease risk and health spectrum.
Right. And is this new book, is it already out? Is it something that's available yet?
Quarterback book will be launched, actually good timing, in 2 to 4 weeks, depending on, I have one reviewer I'm waiting to finish up on a couple things, and then it'll be published, and it'll be on Amazon.
Great. So you're saying did you say about 2 months you're thinking?
No, 2 weeks to 1 month.
2 weeks to 1 month. Oh, great. That's really soon.
Yep. And, if any of your listeners want to ping me and say they heard this through this lecture, this talk, I'd be happy to give them an advanced copy electronically.
That's a great offer. Thank you.
Yeah. So, we're just trying to get the word out. There's an advertisement for some, I think it's some Men's Warehouse or something. He says their best customer is an educated consumer. And
yes.
So, we need to get the word out on what the truth is on these diseases, so that people will then take a much closer look at what we're doing and maybe actually become a customer of our clinics, rather than seeing the neurologist and being put into a state of hopelessness.
And speaking of which, so trying to educate people more, what are some of the quick and simple, maybe top 5 recommendations you have for women on the go, like our listeners, to protect themselves and their families from ever getting Alzheimer's?
Right. So the first thing I'd recommend, and arguably the most important, is to take fish oil. To find a high-quality fish oil like Carlson's or Nordic Naturals, and take fish oil every day. And probably a lot more than you're currently taking. If you are taking it, I recommend at least 5 grams, which is 5 capsules a day. And some people complain of upset, so take it at nighttime. We sleep mainly for the brain to go through repair and recovery. So the best time to take your fish oil is before bed. And then you're not physically active and creating upset and all that. So take your fish oil. The second thing is to support gut health. And so if you're on an antacid or on a proton pump inhibitor, it could be a challenge, but wean yourself off of that. I guarantee you that you don't have too much acid. For most people, 95% of people, they don't have too much acid. They have too little acid, and they're getting that reflux because they're fermenting their food rather than digesting it. So eat fermented food, good quality yogurts, other fermented foods, sauerkraut. Take a little apple cider vinegar before a meal. If you have stomach upset, get that pH and get that gut flora back in health and in good shape. So Robin Chutkin has a book, Gut Bliss and the Microbiome Solution. Those would be good resources for that. The third thing is vitamin D. Up your status. I have a health sheet on my website under patient resources that talks about how much vitamin D you need to take to obtain a high status, and we prefer somewhere around 60 to 70 nanograms per milliliter. And to get there, you're going to be taking around 5,000 units a day. And then the other ones that I mentioned earlier is magnesium is the anti-inflammatory mineral. And so you want to have plenty of magnesium. That'll also help balance, along with vitamin K2, where the calcium goes in your body, not in your vessels, which is atherosclerosis, but back in the bone where it belongs.
Right.
And then the sea salt to try to get those minerals that tend to be depleted from our mechanized agriculture.
Right.
And then since I did mention that, try to eat organic. There really is a reason to eat organic. So get the organic carrots, pack those as a snack, things of that nature. Yesterday, for example, for lunch, I had a carrot, a can of sardines with salsa. And, I know everybody's holding their nose about the sardines, and then I put it on quinoa. But, it's not that bad. Tuna fish and a little quinoa and some coleslaw,
Right.
something of a good coleslaw. So there are plenty of things you can do that are simple and even less expensive than stopping at Mickey D's.
Right.
It does require a little more planning. Of course, Mickey D's solves that spur of the moment reactive mechanism that we've all developed. But it's worth a little extra time, and it doesn't cost extra money to plan ahead, create good, healthy menus, and I believe that nutrition is at least 80% of the prevention for Alzheimer's.
Right.
With exercise and activity. Autophagy, which was assigned the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2016, which basically means your system needs to clear itself of junk. And good food and exercise, with a focus on exercise, is the main thing that stimulates the autophagy system. So
right.
I think those are simple. If there was only one thing someone was going to do, it would be to take 5 capsules of a good quality cod liver oil every night.
That's good advice. So you like cod liver oil in particular?
I prefer cod liver oil, and I'll give you a simple reason. Cod liver oil contains other fat soluble, other than fish oil, it contains the other fat soluble minerals and vitamins and minerals, so vitamin D and vitamin A. Now, if I gave you a multivitamin with beta-carotene, you would have more cancer. If I give you cod liver oil, you will have less cancer. And the reason why is cod liver oil is a natural source of these fat-soluble vitamins that are so important to the brain and our overall health. So
right.
Beta-carotene is a single chemical molecule, whereas vitamin A is a mixture. And you get the mixture in a whole food, whereas some of the supplements, especially the cheaper ones that aren't well designed, that are just high profit substance, cash crops, if you will, tend not to have the proper balance that our bodies require. Our bodies are a symphony, not a flutophone. It's a series of beautifully harmonized notes, not a single terse shriek, if you will.
What a great analogy.
Right, and that's just the way it is. So, I do recommend, magnesium, vitamin D. These are a few single offs that make a big difference. But generally, the more balanced, the more diverse foods, the more natural sources, the better.
Great.
Things we've all heard.
Yep.
Things we've all heard. But now the consequences are being made much more realistic, more real, and more dire.
Yeah.
Is Alzheimer's is a consequence of a lousy diet.
Yes, exactly. And that's really the education, the first part of the education that needs to get out there.
Right. So.
Well, Dr. Lewis, I thank you so much for being with us, and I want to remind our listeners that your website is realhealthclinics.com, and that you have a new book coming out, Quarterback Your Own Health, hopefully within the month. And if they ping you and let them know they heard it through this interview series, that you'll send them a e-copy book.
Right. They can just download it from my website. So yep.
Oh, perfect.
But they need a password. So if they ping me from you, indicating they heard it on your show, I'll send them a password.
Oh, terrific. Thank you so much. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. I enjoyed hearing, some of the background and some of the really exciting things you're doing that a lot of others aren't yet, and I sure hope it starts spreading.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to get the message out, because really knowledge is power, and we need to empower people to start taking on ownership of their own health. And when you do that, I think we're going to solve this medical crisis we have right now in this country.
Absolutely.
It's the only way. It starts with the individual, though, not us.
Right. It does. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate it. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. Be well.
Thank you so much.